The scent of scorched milk hung in the kitchen, a sour, clotted ghost that refused to leave, even with the windows thrown open to the brittle November air. I stood at the stove, my back to the door, my hands moving without thought, setting the kettle to boil, slicing bread that had been baked 3 days ago, before the world split like an overripe gourd left too long on the vine. The footsteps on the back porch were heavy, familiar, my husband's boots, the left one dragging just slightly where the sole had worn thin. He'd been meaning to fix it for a month, he'd been meaning to do a lot of things. The door opened. The cold rushed in and wrapped around my ankles. I did not turn. "Rachel?" His voice was a dry creek bed, parched, cracked, carrying the weight of a stone that had been sitting in it for a long, long time. I kept slicing. The knife blade whispered through the crust, back and forth. A gentle, domestic sound that filled the space where my greeting should have been. "Rachel, I'm home." I set the knife down, very carefully, the blade pointing away from me, the way my mother had taught me when I was small enough to need a stool to reach the counter. I wiped my hands on my apron, smoothing the plain brown fabric over my hips, and finally turned. Samuel Stoltzfus stood in the doorway of our kitchen, his black Sunday hat still in his hands, working the brim in a slow, nervous rotation. His beard was neat, recently trimmed. His white shirt was buttoned to the throat, though the top button was now undone, revealing a sliver of sun-browned skin. His eyes, the same deep, quiet gray as the pond ice in January, met mine, and for a single, suspended moment, neither of us breathed. He had come home. The man who not 4 hours earlier had stood in the congregation of the faithful and raised his hand with all the others, a forest of uplifted palms, a silent, terrible harvest to cast me out, to shun me, to make me a ghost in my own life, to be seen but not heard, to sit at my own table but eat from a separate plate, to be a wife who was no longer a wife. He had voted yes. And now he stood in my kitchen, his nostrils flaring at the smell of burnt milk, his jaw tight with something that might have been grief or might have been righteousness, and he said, "I'm home," as if those words still held the shape they used to. I didn't scream, I didn't cry, I didn't throw the kettle of boiling water at his head, though the thought flickered through my mind like a spark from a dying fire. Instead, I leaned back against the counter, crossed my arms over my chest, a posture my own mother would have scolded me for, so prideful, so defensive, and let the silence stretch between us until it was a living thing, a third presence in the room. "Is there supper?" Samuel asked. The question was so absurd, so ordinary, so impossibly Samuel that a sound escaped my throat. It was not a laugh. It was closer to the noise a wounded rabbit makes when the fox's teeth are too slow to be merciful. "Supper," I repeated. The word tasted foreign. I had been making supper for this man for 7 years. 7 years of roasted chickens and buttery noodles, of pickled beets and choufle pie, of standing at this very stove with a baby on my hip and another tugging at my skirts, waiting for the sound of his boots on the porch. 7 years of being a good Amish wife, a helpmeet, a keeper of the home. And now he wanted to know if there was supper. "You voted to shun me," I said. The words were quiet, almost conversational, but they landed in the room like stones dropped into still water. 1, 2, 3. The ripples spread outward, invisible, irrevocable. Samuel flinched. It was a small movement, a tightening around his eyes, but I saw it. I had spent 7 years learning the map of this man's face, every line and shadow. I knew when he was tired, I knew when he was lying, I knew when he was trying and failing to be something he was not. "It was a members' meeting," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "What happens in the members' meeting is for the members. You know this. I know I am your wife. You broke the ordnung. I asked a question. You questioned the bishop." He took a step into the kitchen, and the floorboards creaked beneath his weight, a sound I had heard 1,000 times in the dark hours of early morning when he rose to tend the horses, in the soft hush of evening when he came to stand behind me and press his lips to the curve of my neck. "You questioned the bishop in front of the entire congregation. You would not be silent. You would not submit. Rachel, what was I to do?" I looked at him, this man I had loved since I was 16 years old, a barefoot girl with skinned knees and a heart full of foolish dreams. This man who had walked me home from singings, who had carved my initials into the trunk of the old oak by the creek, who had held my hand so gently at our wedding, his palm sweating through the white handkerchief. "You were supposed to stand by me," I said. "You were supposed to be my husband." The words hung in the air, and I watched them land, watched them burrow under his skin. His face, so familiar, so dear, crumpled at the edges. "I am your husband," he said, and his voice broke on the last word. "That's why I'm here." But he wasn't here, not really. The man who stood before me was a stranger wearing my husband's face, a man who had chosen the community over his wife, the ordnung over his marriage. And now he expected me to set a plate for him at the table where I would be forced to eat alone on the special black-painted chair reserved for those under the ban. No, I said, you are not my husband, not anymore. The church has decided that, and you agreed. I untied my apron, folded it carefully, and laid it on the counter. Then I walked past him, through the kitchen door and out into the cold November evening, leaving Samuel Stoltzfus alone with the smell of burnt milk and the weight of his own unbearable righteousness. The winter of my discontent began, as all winters do, long before the first snow fell. To understand the shattering of a marriage, you must first understand the building of it. And to understand the building of mine, you must travel back 9 years to a spring evening in 1887 when the apple trees were heavy with blossoms and the air smelled of promise and fresh-turned earth. I was 19 and I was in love with the wrong man. His name was not Samuel. His name was Daniel King, and he was the bishop's son. The King family lived on the largest farm in our district, a sprawling 200 acres of prime Lancaster County soil, with a bank barn so grand it could house 40 head of cattle and still have room for the carriages. Bishop Amos King was a man of considerable presence, tall and broad-shouldered, with a voice that could fill a meeting house and a gaze that could silence a room. He had been our bishop for 12 years, and in that time he had shaped the community in his image, devout, orderly, unquestioning. His son Daniel was cut from the same cloth, but with a charm that his father lacked. Daniel had a way of looking at you that made you feel like you were the only person in the world, a gift he wielded with the casual grace of someone who had never known rejection. When he smiled, the corners of his eyes crinkled, and something in my chest would loosen and tighten all at once. We courted in secret for 6 months. Secret courtship was not unusual among the Amish. Young people often kept their relationships hidden until they were ready to be published in the church, but our secrecy was different. It was not the sweet, anticipatory privacy of young love. It was the furtive, anxious concealment of something that both of us knew, deep in our bones, would not survive the light. Daniel would meet me by the old covered bridge after dark. We would walk along the creek, his hand warm in mine, and he would talk about the future in grand, sweeping terms. He was going to be a bishop someday, he said. He was going to lead the community into a new era of faithfulness, and he wanted me by his side, but there was a condition. There was always a condition. You must learn to hold your tongue, he told me one night, his voice gentle but firm. My father has noticed you. He says you ask too many questions during instruction. He says you have a rebellious spirit. I remember pulling my hand from his, stung. Asking why women cannot vote in members' meetings is a rebellious spirit. It is when you ask it 3 times after you've been told the answer. The answer was not an answer, it was a dismissal. Daniel sighed, the sound of someone burdened by my stubbornness. Rachel, I love you, but love is not enough. A wife must submit to her husband. A member must submit to the church. This is the way of things. I did not submit, not then, not ever. And when Daniel King came to me one evening, his face pale and set, and told me that his father had forbidden the match, that I was too willful, too proud, too questioning to be a bishop's wife, I felt not heartbreak but a strange, bitter relief. The heartbreak came later when I learned that Daniel had already chosen another girl, a quiet girl, a girl who never asked why. Samuel Stoltzfus was not my second choice. He was my unexpected gift. He was a farmer like most Amish men, but he was also a dreamer. He had ideas about crop rotation that the older men scoffed at. He believed in experimenting with new seed varieties, in keeping meticulous records of rainfall and yield. His own father called him impractical, but I saw something different. I saw a man who was not afraid to question the way things had always been done, as long as those questions stayed safely within the boundaries of agriculture. We met at a wedding, one of those sprawling affairs that lasted all day and into the night, with tables groaning under the weight of roast chicken and mashed potatoes and at least 12 different kinds of pie. I was helping in the kitchen as unmarried women did, and he came in looking for a bandage. He had cut his hand on a piece of farm equipment, and someone had told him there was a girl in the kitchen who knew something about wounds. My mother was a healer, I explained, wrapping his palm in clean linen. She taught me a few things before she passed. You're Rachel Yoder, he said, and his eyes met mine with a directness that made my breath catch. You're the one who questioned the bishop last year about the women not being able to attend the members' meetings. I stiffened, expecting reproach, but his next words surprised me. I thought you were brave, he said. I thought there is a woman who is not afraid to speak the truth. We married 10 months later in the fall, when the leaves were turning gold and the air was crisp with the promise of change. Our wedding was simple, as all Amish weddings are, but to me it was a miracle. Samuel had a small farm on the edge of the district, 40 acres of good soil and a farmhouse that needed more work than he had admitted. But it was ours, and I loved it with a ferocity that surprised even me. The first year was the hardest. The farm struggled. The harvest was poor. I miscarried our first child in the cold darkness of February, and I thought the grief would swallow me whole. But Samuel held me through the long nights, his solid presence an anchor in the storm, and gradually the light returned. Lee was born the following spring, a squalling, red-faced miracle who filled our quiet house with noise and joy. Micah came 2 years later, quiet and watchful, the kind of child who would rather sit in a corner with a book, or the Amish equivalent, a primer of German script, than chase after the barn cats. And finally little Sarah, our surprise, who arrived on Christmas morning with a head full of dark curls, and a disposition so sunny it made the rest of us seem dour by comparison. For 7 years we were happy. Not the giddy, breathless happiness of courtship, but the deep-rooted contentment of two people who had chosen each other and kept choosing day after day through drought and abundance, through sickness and health. Samuel worked the land. I kept the house and the garden and the children. We went to church every other Sunday, sitting in our appointed places, men on one side, women on the other, and I learned to swallow my questions along with the communion bread. But questions once planted have a way of growing, and mine had deep roots. It began, as all great upheavals do, with something small. A young woman in our district, a girl really barely 17, came to me in the spring of 1895, her face blotched with tears and her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold the cup of tea I offered her. Her name was Miriam, and she was pregnant. The father was an Englisher, a railroad worker who had passed through the county the previous fall, charming and handsome and utterly gone by the time Miriam realized what had happened. She had tried to hide it, binding her growing belly with strips of cloth, but her mother had noticed. And now she faced the judgment of the church. "They want me to confess before the congregation," Miriam whispered, her voice raw with shame. "I must kneel and speak my sin aloud, and then Bishop King will decide my punishment." "Rachel, I am so afraid." I held her while she cried, my heart breaking. I knew what awaited her. A kneeling confession was the most public humiliation the church could offer, short of excommunication. She would be required to detail her sin before every person she had ever known, her parents, her siblings, her friends, the boys she had grown up with, the old women who had taught her to quilt. And then, if the bishop was merciful, she would be placed under the ban for a period of weeks or months, forbidden from eating with her family, from participating in church activities, from any social contact beyond the barest necessities. If the bishop was not merciful, she would be excommunicated entirely. Cast out, shunned for life. "What can I do?" Miriam asked, her fingers clutching my sleeve like a drowning woman grasping at driftwood. I had no answer. But the question lodged itself in my chest like a splinter, and it festered. The next church Sunday, I watched Miriam kneel before the congregation. Her voice was so quiet that the people in the back strained to hear, and Bishop King made her repeat herself 3 times, louder each time, until her shame echoed off the walls of the meeting house. Her mother wept. Her father stared at the floor, his face a mask of stone. And when it was over, when Miriam had been placed under the ban for 6 weeks, I felt something shift inside me. This was not justice. This was not mercy. This was cruelty dressed in the language of righteousness, and I could no longer pretend otherwise. I went to the bishop's house the following Tuesday. It was not my place, I knew this. Women did not approach the bishop with concerns about church discipline. If I had a question, I was supposed to bring it to my husband, and my husband was supposed to bring it to the deacon, and the deacon would decide if it was worthy of the bishop's attention. This was the chain of authority, the ordnung that governed every aspect of our lives. But I did not go to my husband. I did not go to the deacon. I went directly to Amos King, and I knocked on his door with a heart that pounded so hard I could feel it in my temples. His wife, a thin, nervous woman named Esther, opened the door. Her eyes widened when she saw me, and I knew with a sinking certainty that she already understood why I had come. "Rachel," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "you should not be here. I need to speak with the bishop. Please, go home, it is not your place." But I was already stepping past her into the dim, orderly interior of the King house. Bishop Amos was in his study, a room I had never entered, lined with books and smelling of pipe tobacco and old paper. He looked up when I entered, and his expression was not surprised. It was something closer to resigned. "Rachel Stoltzfus," he said, setting down his pen. "I wondered when you would come. I want to talk about Miriam. Miriam's discipline has been decided. She is a child, she made a mistake, and now she is being humiliated before the entire community. How is this the will of God?" The bishop leaned back in his chair, his eyes steady on my face. You are a woman of strong opinions, Rachel. This is not a sin in itself. But when those opinions lead you to defy the authority of the church, it becomes a matter of concern. I am not defying anyone, I am asking a question. Is that not permitted? Must we be sheep who follow without thought? You are not asking a question, you are making an accusation. You are suggesting that the church's discipline is too harsh, that I as bishop have been unjust. His voice was calm, but there was steel beneath it. This is a dangerous path you are walking. Dangerous to whom? To yourself. To your family, to your soul. I left his house that day with nothing resolved, but the splinter in my chest had become a blade. I could not let it go, I could not. Over the weeks that followed, I spoke to other women, quietly, carefully, in the relative privacy of quilting bees and barn raisings, and what I found horrified me. Miriam was not the only one. There were others, women who had been shamed, silenced, punished for sins that the men of the community would have received only a mild rebuke for. A young widow who had been placed under the ban for speaking too freely to an Englisher at market. A teenage girl who had been forced to kneel before the congregation for wearing a dress with buttons instead of hooks and eyes. Stories of small cruelties and large injustices, all sanctioned by the church, all enforced by Bishop Amos King and the men who supported him. I began to write them down, not with any clear purpose, just to have a record to prove to myself that I was not imagining things, but words once written have a way of finding their own path. One of the women I had spoken to was the deacon's wife. She told her husband, he told the bishop, and 2 days later Samuel came home from the fields with a face like a winter storm. Rachel, he said, and his voice was strange, hollow. The bishop has called a members' meeting. They want you to answer for what you have been saying. The members' meeting was held on a Sunday after the regular church service. Only baptized members were permitted to attend, and women, of course, were not allowed to vote, but they could be questioned, they could be accused. I stood before the congregation, before my neighbors, my friends, the people I had broken bread with and worked beside and prayed with for 7 years, and I listened as Bishop King laid out the charges against me. I had sown discord in the community. I had questioned the authority of the church. I had encouraged other women to do the same, and I had refused to repent when given the opportunity. Rachel Stoltzfus, the bishop intoned, his voice echoing in the silent meeting house, do you confess to these sins? Do you humble yourself before God in this congregation? I looked at him. I looked at the rows of faces, some curious, some hostile, some simply afraid. And then I looked at Samuel sitting in the men's section, his hands clasped so tightly in his lap that his knuckles were white. He was not looking at me, he was staring at the floor. I confess to speaking with my sisters in Christ, I said, my voice steady even as my heart threatened to tear itself from my chest. I confess to listening to their pain. I confess to asking questions about why some sins are punished more harshly than others and why the burden of shame always falls on the women. If that is a sin, then I am guilty. A murmur ran through the congregation. The bishop's face darkened. You are proud, he said. You are rebellious, and unless you repent, there is only one course left to this church. The vote was swift. The men raised their hands, a sea of palms that rose and fell like waves on a turbulent ocean. And among them, his face still turned away from mine, his hand trembling just slightly, was my husband. The bishop pronounced the ban. I was to be shunned. The days after the shunning were the strangest of my life. I had been excommunicated, cut off from the church, but I had not been cast out of my home, not yet. The Amish practice of shunning allowed the excommunicated person to remain with their family, but under strict conditions. I could not eat at the same table as Samuel and the children. I could not cook for them, though I could prepare food that they would then serve themselves. I could not sleep in the same bed. I could not speak to them unless absolutely necessary, and even then my words were to be brief and practical. I was a ghost in my own house. The children did not understand. Lee at 6 kept trying to climb into my lap, kept asking why Mam wouldn't look at her. Micah at 4 simply cried great heaving sobs that shook his small body, while Samuel tried to comfort him with awkward pats on the back. And Sarah, my baby, my sunshine, reached for me with chubby fingers and wailed when I could not reach back. Samuel moved a cot into the barn. He said it was because the house was too crowded, that he needed to be close to the animals during the cold snap. But we both knew the truth. He could not bear to sleep in the room where we had once been husband and wife, knowing that I was downstairs on the kitchen floor, wrapped in quilts, as separate from him as if an ocean lay between us. The first week we said almost nothing to each other. The silence was a physical weight pressing down on my chest until I thought I might suffocate. But the silence was also a protection. As long as we did not speak, I could pretend that this was temporary, that somehow, some way we would find a path back to each other. The second week, Samuel came in from the barn while I was sweeping the kitchen floor. He stood in the doorway watching me, and I could feel the words building up inside him like water behind a dam. "The bishop came to see me today," he said finally. I kept sweeping. The broom moved in steady, rhythmic strokes across the wooden floor. "He said I should consider sending you away to your cousin in Ohio. He said it might be easier for the children if you were not here." My hand tightened on the broom handle. "And what did you say?" "I said I would think about it." I stopped sweeping. I turned to face him. "Do you want me to go, Samuel? Is that what you want?" His face was a battlefield. I could see the war raging behind his eyes, love and duty, fear and faith, the man he was and the man the church demanded him to be. "I don't know what I want," he said. "I don't know anything anymore." He went back to the barn. I finished sweeping the floor, and the silence returned, heavier than before. The third week something broke. It was the middle of the night. I was lying on my pallet in the kitchen, staring at the ceiling when I heard footsteps on the porch. Not the heavy tread of Samuel's boots, but something lighter, more furtive. I sat up, my heart hammering. The door opened and a figure slipped inside, small, cloaked, shaking with cold. It was Miriam. "Rachel," she whispered, her teeth chattering. "I'm sorry, I didn't know where else to go." I broke the shunning without a second thought. I wrapped her in my quilts. I built up the fire. I made her tea strong and sweet, the way my mother used to make it for the sick. And I listened. The baby had come early, a boy small and perfect, born in the middle of the night with only Miriam's mother to help her. But the birth had been difficult and Miriam was still weak, still bleeding more than she should be. Her mother wanted to send for the Englisher doctor, but Miriam's father had refused. The doctor was expensive, he said, and besides, this was God's punishment for her sin. She must bear it. "I'm so cold," Miriam whispered. "Rachel, I think I'm dying." I did not hesitate. I pulled on my boots and my heaviest cloak and I went out to the barn. Samuel was asleep on his cot, his face slack with exhaustion. I shook him awake. "Samuel, I need the horse and buggy now." He blinked at me, confused. "Rachel, what's happening?" "Miriam is in the kitchen. She needs a doctor. She might be dying." He sat up, his face going pale. "But the shunning, damn the shunning," I said, and that word I had never spoken aloud in my life, hung in the air between us like a thunderclap. "There is a girl in my kitchen who is bleeding out her life and she needs help. Are you going to stand in my way?" He stared at me for a long moment. Then he got to his feet, pulled on his coat, and went to harness the horse. We drove through the darkness, Miriam bundled in the back of the buggy, her head in my lap. The roads were rough, frozen solid in the November cold, and the horse's breath came in great white plumes. Samuel drove in silence, his face set and grim. The Englisher doctor lived on the edge of town, in a white clapboard house with a brass plaque by the door. He was an older man, kind-eyed and gentle, and he did not ask questions when two Amish people appeared on his doorstep in the middle of the night with a bleeding girl. He saved Miriam's life. He said if we had waited until morning, she would have been beyond saving. He gave her medicine and bandages and strict instructions for rest, and when dawn broke pale and cold over the horizon, we drove her back to her mother's house where her father stood in the doorway with a face like flint. "You should not have interfered," he said to me, his voice hard. "This was a matter for the family." "She is alive," I said. "That is the only matter." We drove home in silence. The sun was fully up now, painting the frozen fields in shades of gold and rose. When we reached our farm, Samuel pulled the horse to a stop in front of the barn and sat for a long moment, the reins loose in his hands. "I will have to tell the bishop," he said, "about what we did. I know. He will say you broke the shunning. He will say I helped you. I know." He turned to look at me, and there was something in his eyes I had not seen since the day he voted to shun me, something that looked almost like the man I had married. "Why did you do it, Rachel? Why did you risk everything for a girl who is not your family, not your kin, not your concern?" "Because someone had to," I said. "Because someone should have done the same for me." He did not ask what I meant, he already knew. The bishop came the next day. He arrived in his black buggy, his wife sitting beside him with her head bowed, and he did not come to the house. He stood in the yard, his breath misting in the cold air, and waited for Samuel to come out to him. I watched from the kitchen window. I could not hear what they said, but I could see the bishop's face, stern, implacable, a granite wall of righteousness, and Samuel's face, torn, struggling, a man caught between two worlds. The conversation lasted perhaps 20 minutes. Then the bishop climbed back into his buggy and drove away, and Samuel came into the house. He did not look at me. He went to the stove, poured himself a cup of coffee, the coffee I had made, which he was not supposed to drink, and sat down at the table. "The bishop says I must choose," he said quietly. "If I continue to allow you to live in this house, I will be placing my own soul in jeopardy. I will be seen as condoning your rebellion. He says the church will begin to question my own standing." I sat down across from him, the black chair, the chair of the shunned. "And what did you tell him?" Samuel was silent for a long moment. Then he reached across the table and took my hand. It was the first time he had touched me since the shunning began. I told him, he said, his voice rough, that I have spent my whole life trying to be a good man, a good son, a good husband, a good member of the church, and I have failed at all of it. You haven't failed. I voted to shun my own wife. He looked up at me and his eyes were wet. I stood in that meeting and I raised my hand with all the others because I was afraid. Afraid of the bishop, afraid of the community, afraid of being cast out myself, and I have hated myself every moment since. I held his hand, feeling the calluses on his palm, the familiar ridges and valleys of a hand I had held 1,000 times before. Samuel, let me finish. I told the bishop that I have been thinking about Miriam, about you, about the way the church treats the people who ask questions, and I told him that I am no longer sure that what we did was wrong. My breath caught. What did he say? He said that doubt is the devil's work. He said that if I continue down this path, I will find myself standing where you are standing, and he gave me a week to decide. Decide what? Samuel squeezed my hand. Whether I will send you away or whether I will stand with you and risk everything. The week that followed was the longest of my life. Samuel did not send me away, but he did not defy the bishop either. He moved through the days like a man in a dream, doing his chores, caring for the animals, playing with the children. And every night when the children were in bed, he would sit at the kitchen table with a piece of paper and a pencil, writing and crossing out, writing and crossing out. I did not ask what he was writing. I was afraid to know. On the 6th day, a letter arrived. It was from my cousin in Ohio, the cousin who had been offered as my destination if Samuel chose to send me away. She wrote that she had heard of my shunning, that she was praying for me, and that her door was open if I needed a place to go. I read the letter 3 times, then I folded it carefully and put it in my apron pocket. That night after the children were asleep, I went out to the barn. Samuel was there, sitting on his cot, the piece of paper in his hands. I've been writing a letter, he said. I know. It's to the bishop. I've written it a dozen times and I keep throwing it away and then I start over. He looked up at me and his face was haggard, the face of a man who had not slept properly in weeks. Rachel, I don't know what to do. I sat down beside him on the cot. The straw rustled beneath us. The barn smelled of hay and horses and the sharp, clean bite of winter air. I have a letter too, I said, from my cousin in Ohio. His face went still. What does she say? She says she will take me in, the children too, if I choose to bring them. The words hung in the air. Samuel closed his eyes. Is that what you want? He asked. To leave? No, but I cannot stay like this. I cannot be a ghost in my own house. I cannot watch my children grow up from across a room, forbidden to touch them, forbidden to speak to them. I cannot watch you choose the church over me again and again until there is nothing left of us. He opened his eyes. I don't want to choose the church over you. Then don't. It's not that simple. Yes, I said, it is. I took his hand. Samuel, when we married, you told me you thought I was brave. You said I was not afraid to speak the truth, but I have been afraid. Every day for 7 years I have been afraid of asking the wrong question, afraid of offending the wrong person, afraid of being exactly what I have become. And what is that? Honest, about what I see, about what I believe, about the ways this church has failed the people it is supposed to protect. I squeezed his hand. I don't want to leave you, I don't want to take your children away, but I will not pretend to be someone I am not. Not anymore, not for you, not for the bishop, not for anyone. Samuel was quiet for a long time. Then he picked up the piece of paper from his cot and handed it to me. Read it, he said. I unfolded the paper. His handwriting was cramped and uneven, the letters slanting across the page as if they were trying to escape. To Bishop Amos King and the Congregation of the Faithful, I am writing this letter because I can no longer remain silent. For 7 years I have watched my wife Rachel serve this community with faithfulness and love. I have watched her tend the sick, comfort the grieving, and care for those who had no one else to care for them. And I have watched this community repay her with suspicion, censure, and finally excommunication. I voted to shun my wife. I raised my hand with the others, and I will carry the shame of that moment for the rest of my life. I told myself I was being faithful to the church. I told myself I was doing my duty, but I was not being faithful. I was being a coward. Rachel asked questions that needed to be asked. She spoke for those who had no voice, and for this she was cast out. This is not justice. This is not mercy. This is not the way of Christ, who ate with sinners and tax collectors and welcomed the outcast. I will not send my wife away. I will not separate her from her children. And I will not pretend that what this church has done is right. If this means that I too must be placed under the ban, then so be it. I would rather be shunned with a clear conscience than accepted with a guilty one. I am writing this letter because my wife taught me what courage looks like. It looks like a woman who will not be silent, even when the whole world tells her to be quiet. It looks like a woman who will risk everything for the truth, and I am writing this letter because I love her. I have always loved her. I was just too afraid to show it. In faith and in hope, Samuel Stoltzfus. I finished reading. The paper trembled in my hands. When I looked up, Samuel was watching me with an expression I had not seen on his face since our wedding day, fear and hope and love, all tangled together like threads in a loom. "Is this what you really believe?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "I don't know what I believe anymore," he said, "but I know I believe in you, and I know that I would rather lose the church than lose my family." I kissed him then for the first time since the shunning began. His lips were cold and chapped and tasted of salt, and I did not care. I kissed him as if he were oxygen and I was drowning. I kissed him as if the world were ending and this was the only thing that mattered. And when we finally pulled apart, both of us breathing hard, he said, "I'll deliver the letter tomorrow. Whatever happens after that, we'll face it together." The letter was delivered. The bishop read it, or so we heard later in the privacy of his study. He did not respond. He did not call another members' meeting. He simply waited. The silence from the church was deafening. For days, no one came to our farm. No one spoke to us at market. The other families in the district acted as if we had ceased to exist. We were living in a kind of limbo, not fully shunned, but not fully accepted either. And then, on a Sunday morning in early December, a buggy pulled into our yard. It was not the bishop's buggy. It was a smaller, plainer carriage, driven by a man I recognized only vaguely, one of the younger deacons, a quiet farmer named John Lapp who had never spoken much in the meetings I had attended. Beside him sat his wife, a plump, kind-faced woman named Rebecca. They climbed down from the buggy and stood in the yard looking uncertain. Samuel went out to meet them, and I watched from the kitchen window, my heart pounding. They spoke for perhaps 5 minutes. Then Samuel came back into the house, a strange expression on his face. "They want to talk to us," he said, "both of us together." We sat in the kitchen, Samuel and I on one side of the table, John and Rebecca Lapp on the other. I made coffee. Rebecca accepted it with a smile. John held his cup in both hands, staring into the dark liquid as if it might reveal the future. "We read your letter," John said finally. Rebecca and we read it together. And Samuel said, "And we've been talking about Miriam, about Rachel, about the way the church handles difficult questions." He looked up and his eyes were troubled. "We have been in this community our whole lives. Our parents were in this community, their parents before them. We have always believed that the Ordnung is the way, the only way, but lately Rebecca and I have been wondering." "Wondering what?" I asked. Rebecca answered. "Wondering if the way we do things is God's way or just the bishop's way." The words were so close to my own thoughts that I felt a jolt of recognition run through me. I looked at Samuel, he looked at me, and something passed between us, a silent communication, a shared understanding. We were not alone. "There are others," John said quietly. "Not many, but some. People who read your letter or heard about it. People who have been afraid to speak up. People who have been waiting for someone else to go first." "You went first," Rebecca said to me. "You asked the questions no one else would ask, and we let you be punished for it. We sat in that meeting and we watched the men raise their hands and we said nothing." "We came to apologize," John said, "and to tell you that you are not as alone as you think." The winter passed slow and cold, but we were not alone. John Lapp and a handful of other families began to visit our farm in the evenings when the work was done and the darkness provided a thin veil of privacy. We would sit in the kitchen, drinking coffee and talking in low voices, sharing stories and fears and hopes. It was not a rebellion, not yet. It was more like a whispered conversation, a tentative reaching out across the divide that the bishop had created. The bishop, of course, learned of it. He could not help but learn. Our district was small, and secrets had a way of seeping through the cracks like water through a leaky roof. He called another members' meeting in February. This time we were not invited, but we heard about it anyway from John Lapp, who came to our farm directly afterward, his face pale and set. "The bishop wants to excommunicate you both," he said. "Permanently. He says you have created a schism, that you are leading the faithful astray." He called for a vote. And Samuel asked. It failed. John's voice shook slightly. He needed a unanimous vote for permanent excommunication. It failed by 3 hands, 3 men who had refused to cast us out. It was not a victory, not yet. The ban was still in place. I was still shunned. But it was a beginning, a crack in the wall that had seemed so impenetrable. Spring came early that year, the snow melting into rivulets of silver water that ran down the furrows of the fields. The air warmed and the first green shoots of wheat began to push through the thawing earth, and something else pushed through as well. Something that had been buried deeper than the wheat, germinating in the darkness, waiting for its moment. The bishop's son Daniel came to our farm. He arrived alone on foot, walking the 3 miles from his father's house. I saw him coming up the lane, a solitary figure against the pale spring sky, and my heart seized in my chest. I had not spoken to Daniel King since the night he told me his father had forbidden our match. 9 years of silence, of careful avoidance, of pretending that the man I had once loved was a stranger to me, but he was not a stranger. And when he stood before me on the porch, his face older and wearier than I remembered, I felt the weight of all those years pressing down on me. "Rachel," he said, "I need to speak with you." We sat on the porch steps as we had done so many times in our youth, and he told me his story. "My father is dying," he said. "The doctor says it's his heart. He has months, perhaps less." I nodded. I had heard rumors. "And I have been thinking," Daniel continued, "about what happened, about Miriam, about you, about the things my father has done in the name of the church." He paused, his jaw working. "I have been thinking about the kind of man I want to be, the kind of bishop I want to be when my time comes. And what kind is that? Not like my father." He turned to look at me, and his eyes were bright with something I could not name. "I loved you, Rachel, once. And I let my father tell me you were not good enough. I let him choose my wife for me, a woman who has been a faithful helpmeet but who has never challenged me, never questioned me, never made me think. And I have been comfortable, but I have not been honest." He took a breath. "When my father dies, the church will need a new bishop. I am the obvious choice, but I want to be a different kind of bishop. I want to be a bishop who listens, who shows mercy, who remembers that the ordnung was made for man, not man for the ordnung." I stared at him. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I want to lift the ban," he said. "When I am bishop, I want to welcome you back, both of you, and I want to begin a conversation about how we can do better." About how we can be better. I did not know what to say. For so long I had seen Daniel King as the villain of my story, the man who had rejected me, whose father had persecuted me. But here he was, offering something I had never expected: redemption. It took another year. Bishop Amos King died in June as the wheat was ripening in the fields. His funeral was the largest the district had ever seen, attended by Amish and Mennonites and even some Englishers who had known him as a formidable if rigid man of God. Daniel was chosen as the new bishop 3 months later, in a members' meeting that lasted from morning until well past dark. I heard about it from John Lapp, who came to our farm with the news. "It was not unanimous," John said, his face alight with something like hope, "but it was close. And his first act as bishop, his first act was to call for a reconsideration of your case." The new members' meeting was held in November, almost exactly a year after the meeting that had shunned me. This time I was invited. This time I stood before the congregation not as an accused sinner but as a woman who had been wronged. The vote was not unanimous either. Some of the older members, the ones who had been closest to the old bishop, voted to keep the ban in place, but they were outnumbered. When the new bishop Daniel King announced that the shunning was lifted, that I was welcomed back into full fellowship with the church, I felt something break open inside me, something that had been locked tight for a very long time. Samuel was beside me. His hand found mine, and he held it right there in front of the entire congregation as if daring anyone to object. No one did. That night I stood in my kitchen, our kitchen, and I made supper: roasted chicken, buttery noodles, pickled beets, choufle pie, all the dishes I had made 1,000 times before, but somehow they tasted different tonight. They tasted like freedom. Samuel came in from the barn, stamping the mud from his boots. The children were already at the table, Lee and Micah and little Sarah, their faces clean and their eyes bright, waiting for Ma'am and Dee to sit down together for the first time in a year. "It smells good," Samuel said. "It's done," I said. "Come and eat." He walked over to me, and before he sat down, he pressed his lips to my forehead. It was a small gesture, gentle and familiar, but it carried the weight of everything we had survived. "Thank you," he said. "For what? For not giving up on me, for not leaving," his voice roughened, "for teaching me what courage looks like." I looked at him, this man who had voted to shun me, who had broken my heart and then mended it, who had chosen fear and then chosen love, and I felt the last of the ice around my heart melt away. "We taught each other," I said. We sat down at the table together. The black chair was gone. I had burned it myself in the yard, watching the paint bubble and peel as the flames consumed it. In its place was a new chair, built by Samuel's hands, simple and plain and sturdy. The children chattered. The food was hot and good, and when Samuel reached across the table to take my hand, I held on. Outside, the first snow of winter began to fall, dusting the fields in white, covering the scars of the past year with something clean and new. Not a forgetting, but a healing, not an ending, but a beginning. We had been broken, we had broken each other. But we had also learned that broken things, when mended with enough care and enough love, could be stronger than they were before. And that, I thought, as I watched the snow fall and felt the warmth of my family around me, was a truth worth waiting for.